Hello, everybody. Welcome to another walk in the wilds to exercise my body and perhaps our intelligence. This is an unplanned talk, so I'm not sure what topics I'll reflect on. But since I introduced the idea of intelligence, I might start by talking a little bit about that. I've always had an unusual relationship with language. And it's possible that at least one of my parents was concerned about this when I was little, because I was rather precocious and fairly articulate for my age. When I entered kindergarten, I probably knew 20 long Latin words for the scientific names of dinosaurs. I don't remember them all anymore. In fact, I remember very few of them. But I was an early reader, and that led to me reading a lot of all kinds of different material. But the thing I think I was primarily interested in when I was little, which might be a little surprising to people who know me well now, I was very interested in machines. Cars and automobiles, televisions and radios, telephones, computers, eventually. First calculators, those seemed impossibly fascinating. And aircraft. And war machines, spacecraft. Of course, I was very young when the moonshots were taking place, and those had an incredible effect on me and my imagination. By far, most of what I read when I was youngish, up until probably my 30s, I avidly read all the science fiction I could get my hands on. And I was particularly curious about female authors, some of whom took on pen names. And occasionally, within that library there was quite a bit of fantasy too. The Lord of the Rings books radically altered my universe. But every story I read, many of them were profoundly astonishing. And it seemed that much later, when I could reflect back, that science fiction was a place where prophets could hide in the modern context. I read thousands of science fiction stories, probably more than 3,000 books in that topic. So I was really interested in language, and there's all kinds of strange problems with our relationships with language. And language in our species might be evidence of something stranger than we've been bold enough to imagine. Although there are branches of culture where wild, flagrant imaginings take place that perhaps don't have much to do with what's really going on, and are at least modestly delusional. Though there's an intelligence, usually, a form of intelligence within delusion, for those of us capable of decrypting it. And so when I use the word intelligence, the common definition is something like the ability to foresee and use structured methods to solve problems. That presumes that there are problems. I don't have too much trouble with that idea. But usually when we hear the word intelligence, immediately we first think of humans. And then we think of cognition, thinking. We think about thinking when we hear the word intelligence, most of us, not all of us. And the incompleteness of language is one of the things we struggle with. As a writer, it can be very difficult to choose a word because I'm aware of the likelihood that it may be misconstrued unless I choose very carefully or context it carefully or admit openly that I don't mean it in an absolute way or an explicit way. And I think the lazy part of what we're trained to do with language, which is extremely unfortunate because it wrecks our minds, is to think that words have meanings. We know what the meanings are already. And the scope is universal and the meanings are explicit. This is somewhat like how a machine might be able to process language without having the slightest capacity to understand anything at all. Machines don't have understanding. Understanding is a quality of organisms. And its emulation in machines is fascinating and dangerous. But what's really peculiar is the idea that humans, apparently modern humans, think that machines can be intelligent. Now, we can certainly change the definition of intelligence so that machines qualify. Or we can modulate the definition. And that's a very dangerous thing. Because the idea of intelligence is a holophore, a fundamental idea, upon which many other ideas absolutely depend, and from which they draw their meanings and connotations and usages. So if we change that word much, we really change the meaning of everything. And to exchange embodied awareness and the structured processes on the surface of cognition for their deeper origins and imperatives could be catastrophic for human intelligence. Now, I too am subject to the training most of us get, the scripting and imprinting we experience in childhood and beyond. We experience it all throughout our lives. That when I first hear the word intelligence, I might be inclined to think about the verbal conceptual modeling, problem framing, mathematics, physics, geometry, the sciences, and so on. And that's one of the meaningful senses of the word. But in the same way, my first name doesn't tell you much about me. The word intelligence can easily mislead us, or rather, we can mislead ourselves with it, because words can be a lot like mirrors. And over time, rather than exploring them, we will tend to collapse into habits that essentially cause the mirror to produce the image we're expecting, the image we're habituated to familiarity with. I hear a woodpecker, and I'm fairly sure, or at least I suspect, that what it's doing on the tree, making the sound, is not eating. It's a sonic display phenomenon. It communicates all kinds of things that most humans aren't experienced at sensing, myself included. Yet I'm aware of the undiscovered country behind the sound I'm hearing. And I know that sound is probably older than my species is in flat time. And given the time of year, it probably has something to do with both repelling competing suitors and acquiring the attention of what I will here presume is a female. I heard this same sound yesterday in the same place. I'm hoping that the sound may have been transcoded by the microphone and the smartphone. It's a very rapid series of tapping sounds, percussion, and each presentation, each enaction of this ancient way of being in the world has many features that are inclined to escape our common awareness. Partly because they're from outside the field of ideas and phenomena we regularly attend. The percussions are very rapid, almost like a vibration. And each enaction has a different number of strikes. And even in a single pattern, there is variation in the strength of the strikes. The animal is choosing directionality, volume, and in a way, is presenting something of its soul and character to the world. We live on a planet that must be extremely rare in time-space. Even if there are many worlds with life, ours is paradisical in the sense that, well, in many senses, but in the sense that it's swarming with uniquely embodied intelligences. Like the birds that I meet here in the back of the garden. Now usually, when I bring treats for the birds, they're very excited. And they readily accept them. And the male of the pair that I'm with took the food I gave it. But the female looked at me very carefully, and even though there was food in easy reach and the male was busy elsewhere, she didn't pick up the food and instead left the area. She is aware of something I can't sense. But if I pay close attention to her, it may become possible for me to sense parts of what she is aware of. The male and the female hitchhike on each other's unique intelligences, and that produces a superposition that neither of them could experience or embody alone. Similarly, when my intelligence is included with theirs, I gain new senses. I have the opportunity to discover things about myself, life, these particular animals, the situation right here, right now, that would be otherwise either extremely difficult for me to notice or impossible. It's common for humans to believe that we are the only intelligent species here, and I regularly see rather stupidifying headlines in which it is claimed that researchers have discovered that some specific animal has the kind of particular problem-solving intelligence that we associate with humans and usually think of when we think of the word intelligent. But there are as many kinds of intelligence as there are organisms. More. Because it's not merely organisms that embody intelligence. Yet as organisms, we're certainly particularly sensitive and inclined to at least have the opportunity to participate with other living intelligences. And one of the terrible ironies here involves the tragic fact that our relationship with language and knowledge appears to have been largely captured by forces we're only beginning to understand how to speak clearly about. And there may or may not be aspects to these forces that we would think of as metaphysical. And of course, whether we think of them as metaphysical or not depends a lot on the frameworks we're using and our habits and history of thought and so on. Also our concerns, our purposes. For whenever we explore or analyze something, our purposes in doing so pre-frame the specific kinds of outcomes that we may have access to. In the garden, and some other places, there used to be more outside the garden, but the city is a very difficult place for animals to live. But in the garden there are cohorts of birds, and they form complex social sensing bodies together. And you can see, for example, in a group of sparrows, the incredible sophistication that they're capable of embodying and demonstrating, particularly if there's an opportunity or a threat. Because either one of those conditions, if the birds sense them, will transform the character of the cohort. And the character is very complex because each bird has a unique way of being a bird. A sparrow, a hawk, an owl, a raven, a wren, a robin, a mockingbird, a blackbird, a hummingbird, a bat. And when you put that uniqueness together in a team that's at once somewhat competitive, certainly has competitive members, doesn't mean they're only competitive or they're always competitive. And then there are sensitive members, and they're each uniquely sensitive. Each bird is a different age, has a different history, is in the situation in a unique way. And that gives them the opportunity to form something we might analogize in technology as an antenna or an array of antennas that inform each other's capacities for sensing, awareness, signaling, responding to opportunity or threat. And so if you watch the birds, you'll see that there are birds that become disturbed long before others do. And there are birds that don't become disturbed long after most of them have. It's almost as if the birds know what I'm talking about right now. Long ago, before the advent of technology, as we understand it today, humans, living places, and organisms formed connected sensoriums. Humans weren't merely the enemies of animals. And animals weren't merely a resource, nor were plants. There was a deep, innate awareness of communality, communion, that our lives all depend upon each other, and that our senses and minds depend upon each other. And we can see how easily this goes wrong in modern technological situations. But long ago, our ancestors had whole arrays of senses that we have little or no experience of, though many of us were born with those potentials. We inherited them. And probably not merely genetically, even if there's fairly strong evidence for the contribution of genes to character and health and intellect and mental behavior and metabolic behavior and so on. It's fascinating that as our species has become more technically intelligent, that is to say, more capable of framing problems in models, concepts, and language in such a way that inclines us to first recognize that there is a problem and then to try to resolve it. As this process has continued, our senses went dark. And perhaps things other than merely our senses, because our senses, well, again, we have the problem of words. What do we mean by these words? What do I mean? What is usually meant? But without coherent integration, meaningful, purposeful synthesis, our senses, while still relatively concretely reliable, I can tell whether I'm cold or hot, hungry or tired, sick or well, whether my balance is working or not. But when our senses lose their foundations in relation, authentic relation, organismal relation, while they remain superficially trustworthy, on deeper levels, things go sideways, so to speak. It's ironic that as we've, as a species, that's what I mean by we here, as our species has developed methods and machines of incredible sophistication, something's been sacrificed. Something so essential that it deprives us of most of what's actually accessible to us as organisms and beings and animals and humans. And that essential shining water, sparkling with the original light of being and incarnation, turns to dark shadows of war, omnicidal activity with each other and the environment. We haven't actually become more intelligent as a species, though one could meaningfully argue that the opportunities that are at least available, whether or not they get enacted and embodied in the modern circumstance, educationally and so on, are vastly different from what was available, say, 500 years ago, or 200 years ago, or even 100 years ago. In some ways, the world has changed very dramatically over even the past 20 years. And cognitively, we're living in a completely different universe. A layered universe of representations and abstractions, models and language, concepts, habits, behaviors, imperatives, many of which are not only inhuman, they're profoundly toxic. There's an old rosemary plant here. That I enjoy relating with. But in order to be able to relate with it meaningfully, I have to let go of all of the concepts and habits and ideas and language and models that are common to my people, and allow that storm in the surface of my mind to settle down into a kind of living silence. And I've discovered that all of the different organisms have unexpected abilities to communicate in a way that utterly defies common human expectation, theory, ideas, practice. They can make and communicate with forms of silence that are emotionally musical. And we can make these forms of silence too. We can learn to. In fact, before we acquired language, this was our way. Though occasionally we would cry out or laugh or squeal or chirp. And when I think about intelligence in a deep way, so that I'm not merely referring to, there's the reason why the female, yep, there's why she wouldn't take the food. Right near where I was presenting them with food, there was a hawk hidden in a tree. And it just now left that tree. And if I were not paying very close attention, I would have missed it. And even though I'm speaking, I'm still paying attention too. Thankfully it's not, though I have to admit, once I start making face noises, I tend to become extremely interested in continuing to make face noises and such. And all of the things I'm thinking, and the path of my thought, and the threads, and the memory, so that I can synthesize and complete thoughts, and so on. Nonetheless, I've learned to share that awareness with my embodied awareness. And I also want to mention that even though I saw the hawk and connected it with the female's behavior, I don't entirely believe my theory. And you can see how it's very tempting. This is another problem. Certain forms of intellectual activity, thought, evaluation, comparison, valuation, are tempting. And they're tempting to an aspect of what we often refer to as ego. And personally, I've gotten in great trouble because of this. Because I found it extremely tempting to be able to formulate, articulate, and communicate about experiences that aren't ordinary. And of course someone could say, well, fundamentally all experiences are ordinary. But that's a different meaning or sense of that word. And when I say not ordinary, I mean something like rare, subtle, easily overlooked, not inherently conceptual, perhaps not inherently logical or rational, possibly metaphysical, not in the sense of having nothing to do with physical embodiment, but in the sense of faculties and presence in forms of awareness that are not merely local to my body, or maybe even my lifetime. And in case you think there aren't such things, language is just such a thing. You didn't make language. You inherited it. It's a tradition. And we undergo a complex ladder, spiral stairwell of uniquely re-embodying the traditions that we're imprinted with. But I want to return for a moment to what I mean by non-ordinary. It's my experience that there are aspects of our humanity, our nature as beings and organisms and animals, that have so little to do with how we ordinarily think and the ways, the frameworks we use to think, that whether or not they're innately magical, they may as well be. Now you can see the same problem in modern human culture. Whether or not there are actual demons that have infected the collective body of our species, there might as well be. Because our collectives act in ways that are similar to what we might expect had they become possessed by demons. All day, every day. And in fact, we instance demonic-like things. By the way, I'm using the old, weird, semi-Christian version of demon here, and there are other versions that are interesting, the daimon of the Greeks and so on. But here I'm speaking of the toy, right? An endlessly hungry being that dominates, tortures, and kills. And is itself perhaps not even real in the sense of being embodied, but becomes instead a sort of a network problem, right? Its embodiment could be local to a single individual who's gone mad with the desire to kill and dominate and torture and win, to be right, to be correct. So these forces, these properties, trends, and expressions in our human collectives, they could be thought of as the result of the imposition of metaphysical evil. But there's a simpler explanation, and I'm not necessarily saying I prefer it, or there's a simpler model, which is just that when deep intelligence and the wisdom that arises in authentic mutual concern, learning, play, reverence, wonder, awe. And you hear me, if you've listened to me before, you've heard that list before. Joy, discovery, co-being. When that gets counterfeited or overwhelmed by noise and superficial sophistication, something very similar to actual evil results. And our intelligence dies off into the structured, superficial wrappings and imperatives that dominate the living world at present. It's only been a very short time that that's been true, though humans have had a problem with large collectives for a long, long time. And I remember in my 20s, because I've been concerned about these things throughout my entire life, there were all kinds of ugly problems. I was fascinated by the opportunity of going to school. I thought, this is going to be the most amazing adventure. I can't wait. And I remained fascinated for a long time in my youth. But almost immediately it was clear to me that the purpose of the school wasn't precisely the same as what was presented. And the unique novelty and character of each child was getting amputated and circumcised to make them fit into a structured, superficial narrative that, quite frankly, was mostly bullshit, and most of that bullshit was toxic. And it isn't because math and language are inherently bad. It's because the imperatives that underlie our communal behavior around them have been captured by something toxic. And I found it tragic to watch the little children trying to contend with forces they were ill-equipped to understand or resist. In my youth, I was lucky. I was very resilient. And I found ways to grow my intelligence even in contexts that profoundly opposed that possibility. I like to think I still do. But when I'm really being intelligent, thinking doesn't have a lot to do with what's going on. And again, I return to the problem of ego and how pleasing it is for me to feel that I've noticed something that others don't see. And you'll see this getting strangely played out in all kinds of bizarre modern contexts where someone stands up and says, I can see what others don't. It's not very interesting, actually, or rather, the fact that it's superficially charismatic is opposed by the common result, which is actually a form of various myriads of forms of sophisticated stupidity. which again, I myself am vulnerable to. And I got in a lot of trouble with this problem because I'm something of a performer. I like to I like to perform. And I like to be seen as intelligent, articulate, skillful, hopefully mindful too, but that's not as charismatic. And that charisma, that seeming to shine out from among the crowd, and the desire for that experience and that feeling and the benefits that may accrue to one thus disposed is gravitic. So when I saw the hawk, I remembered the behavior of the female and the specific calls she made as she departed the area. Because I was new to the area and she'd been there all day, she was intimate with what was going on right at that moment. And when I saw her looking at me strangely, I became concerned that perhaps there was something wrong with me, right? Perhaps there was something not good about me today. And admittedly, today's been a bit of an anxious day for me. It's been a little rocky. Maybe more than a little. But when I saw the hawk, I didn't immediately make the connection between her sounds which were the kinds of sounds she made. The character of her calls is familiar to me. I've heard it before. I've heard it when corvids, particularly in this case blue jays, are harassing a nearby raptor. That's the kind of call she made. When I first saw the hawk, I was so excited to have discovered why she was troubled. And my ego sort of became interested. Oh, you're very perceptive, Darren. You're very smart. Now this important riddle has been answered. And then I remembered all the times I got in trouble that way, and so retreated a bit from my certainty back into mindful awareness. Rarely, if ever, is this associated with the idea of intelligence. The superficial kinds of intelligence, the forms of intelligence that are on the surface of consciousness, in thought and language, concept and model, can be extremely deceptive, because it's very exciting to think that one of us or some group of us over time have solved a great mystery. In point of fact, none of the mysteries are solved, because they all have mysterious antecedents and components, layers and constellations that get ignored when we produce the synthesis. E equals mc squared. Why is there E? Why is there M? What does equal mean, really? Why do we have this symbol? Why is it that matter, the mass of something, multiplied by what we understand as the speed of light, gives us a quantity, numbers, with which we can determine how much energy is locally available there. The strange thing about the superficial intelligence is that it makes tokens and uses tokens to represent things in models and then analyzes them. And this isn't inherently a bad thing, but if the results are captured by possessed cohorts, collectives, and transformed into machines and toxicity and death, then I'd argue that's not really intelligence. I read some quote earlier today. I don't remember the exact wording, but something like intelligence without wisdom leads to destruction. And maybe by wisdom we mean something like, or we might mean, the possibilities of our intelligence when they're encompassed by something older, deeper, more trustworthy, more authentic, more present in the moment, more present in relationships, aware of relationships, and the capacity to feel and experience deep within ourselves the ecstatic wonder of being alive at all. This garden, I think, is about 70 years old. But the noise floor and the forms of noise, including EM radiation, radio, wireless signals, cell phone signals, so on, has exploded, not merely over that 70 years, but particularly over the last 20, if we're talking about the non-sonic noise, the inaudible noise, the electromagnetic noise. And historically, humans have been catastrophically ignorant about enacting technologies whose repercussions they're wildly incapable of understanding or even entertaining the complexities of. Our cells rely on complex electromagnetic relationships at the membrane and in other parts of the cell for all kinds of purposes. But those purposes are communicatory in the sense that transformations in the cell are expressed into the cellular environment, where other cells become aware of them and also transform. Our neurons are a bit like this, right? They're a network event, even though, yes, we can pick a single neuron and maybe learn some things about what it's doing with signaling and reception and transformation and chemistry, molecules, and so on. as a species, we have the capacity for unimaginable sophistication of sensing and intelligence. But most of what we get is the toxic wrapper. And that's something I would love to see amended. I'd love to see our children and our elders and every person all throughout their life constantly experiencing new forms of awareness and sensing, possibility, opportunity, and role in social contexts that weren't primarily toxic. So it's ironic that the species that thinks of itself as the smart one is pretty much killing everything, including its own intelligence, all day, every day, in 5 new ways per second, and this has been going on for a long time now, especially if we imagine time as embodied in the organisms thus affected, rather than just linear time, 1 year equals 1 year. Because in embodied time, a year is a many-layered infinity of temporalities and relationships. And this is obvious to anyone who pauses to reflect upon it with any degree of awareness. I think that tragedy is linked to accidents in our cognitive evolution. And stories we have only very partial records of. The nonverbal intelligences, the cellular intelligences, the intelligences of our organs, the intelligences that only arise in deep, authentic relational contexts and roles and behaviors and situations. These are the origins of the other stuff. And they're vastly more trustworthy because although they can be enticed to defect from our nature and interiority, they remain true to it, even if they enact superficial defections as part of our everyday activity and social situations. But it's very strange that the animal that thinks it's the smart one around here is actually the profoundly broken one. And the endless library of the opportunities and possibilities for our people is still conserved in what remains of the living places, the animals, the sky, the stars, the sun, the moon, the plants, the waters, the deserts, the frozen places. These are where our minds were born. Perhaps these are what our minds are actually for. In the sense of comprising an integrative layer where the capacity for formal representational cognition doesn't merely collapse into its darkest, most confused, and most toxic results. I don't know the answers to all the mysteries, though I have some interesting clues. And over time, as I continue to explore, my perspective changes. I'm not just religious. And I don't believe much of what I'm capable of thinking, and I believe even less of what I'm capable of saying. Or rather, there's some belief there, but it's shallow. And I like that it's shallow because I need for it to be interrupted by insight. And it's interesting that that word isn't outsight, it's insight. Seeing within. And seeing in the sense of deep, emotionally rich understanding. Arising from long consideration, mindful embodiment, and deep mutual concern for all beings. This looks more to me like intelligence than all the computers humans will ever produce. In the past 200 years, I don't know how many machines we've made, but an estimate at the current automobile population is 1.4 billion. Endlessly hungry machines that kill by going. They're not intelligent. They kill everything in their path, with the rare, sometimes beautiful exception. And it's as if our species has been parasitized by something that resembles an aspect of intelligence, unless that aspect dominates. And when that happens, apocalypse ensues. Inside us, in our minds, in our cultures, in our ecologies. That can't be intelligent. Recently I heard some strange media noises about an Israeli professor who claimed that a recent visitor to our solar system might be an alien artifact, and further, that aliens don't make contact with our species because we're not intelligent. I think he said we're too stupid. And I can understand some of that. Though I think he's presenting a very personal opinion. And though I won't belabor this point, whatever we refer to as minds, these are not possessions. They're something we participate in. They're the result of participating in all kinds of things and being exposed to all kinds of forces and catalysts and processes that we're incapable of thinking about formally. Though we might get a handle on some of them, so to speak. But what I wanted to say was that, like being human, intelligence is extremely sensitive to context. Change the context, you get a different mind. When someone I love shows up and I'm able to have a conversation with them or go for a walk, I am transformed. Whatever was going on in my little isolated brain bag prior to that, some of it's still going on. Some of it's so momentous that it's hard to dial it down unless we practice. And it can be very useful to practice that if we would like to discover what actual intelligence looks like, and we certainly have the capacity to participate in it. But I think our minds, particularly the superficial minds, but maybe even deeply, they're the results of layers of relation and maybe even something before societies. And what I mean by that is endless families of beings over time. Our minds are much stranger than we imagine. And I don't think they're like the way we tend to model them. We're participating in something. And if that something is primarily in the human socium, many branches of that tree have been captured and counterfeited. And so we will reproduce them as mind-like states and activities unless we're very sensitive and aware, unless the ancient inner pathfinding senses awaken. And when that happens, invariably we will discover that our minds are not possessions at all. They're gifts. Our species has the opportunity to embody astonishing roles in nature, in the universe, in time-space. Unless, of course, they're captured and counterfeited by the strange processes that swarm throughout human technological societies, what we call modern societies. In which case, most of us will live blinded inside. And though we were born with 70 different wings for 100 kinds of flying together and with nature, with origin, many of us will live and die having only tasted it briefly in childhood. It's not the only thing that happens. When I think in generalities and abstractions, my purposes in so doing will determine what I notice. But there's every kind of exception. There are humans whose hearts are so beautiful that to be exposed to them for even a few moments would change our life forever. Some of those humans are infants. Some of them are children. Some of them are teens, young adults, middle-aged people, older people, dying people, sick people. So you can see that our ideas of value are profoundly confused in general, and yet we may become exceptional in ways whose brightness cause the relatively dim brightness of egoic charisma, or I'm the one who knows what's true, to fade away and be obliterated in ecstatic inner seeing as the tree of wings filled with eyes inside us comes back to life, if only for a moment. That moment can change everything for our life path. And when I think of the idea of making a contribution to the world, my people, all the beings, this is the kind of contribution I deeply hope for, and am, in my clumsy and sometimes misguided way, pursuing. Thank you for walking with me today. I look forward to new explorations, healing, discovery, wonder, play, and joy together very soon. Bye-bye for now.